Perhaps I can just start by saying I am a former pupil of Hackney Downs, but I've been working on the history of the school. This isn't sort of a nostalgia trip, I hope, but looking at I think there's three very interesting things about the school. Over its 125 years history, it went through almost every phase of English secondary education, starting as it was set up by the Grocers' Company, but not for the sort of middle. It was very different, definitely for the sort of lower middle classes, trying not to just emulate the public school thing of being an elevator into universities. That experiment soon fizzled out, and then it became I'm just summarising, I'm going to go into this in more detail. That fizzled out because parents actually wanted the more public school pattern, so that for the next 30 years it was emulating the public school pattern. At that stage, the LCC came in and took over the school, and there was half the boys from that period, roughly speaking, were receiving free education. The others, with grants from the LCC, the others were still fee paying, until that sort of double pattern went on until the Butler Act in 1944, at which stage the school obviously came under the LCC, and there was free education for all. That period really was academically the one on the right. Yeah. Yeah. Is it possible to have the blackout down now? Thank you.
Can we use the microphone, please?
Sorry, yeah. I was. Can you hear at the back with this? Good. So another very interesting thing about the school was that it was one of the, rather than fighting comprehensivisation in the 60s, there was a sort of liberal group within the staff who positively welcomed the comprehensive model, and for 10 or 15 years it was a leading comprehensive school, and then for reasons that we'll explore, things began to decline. I thought I'd start with I think it's very interesting with schools the way that myths prevail. There's two interesting little anecdotes or myths that boys from the school remembered and sort of epitomise the way people think of a particular period in the school. There was a headmaster in the early 50s who I found it difficult researching to find anybody who particularly liked the guy. And the two quite funny little incidents. One was that after he'd been there a couple of years, he called the head boy to his study and said, I've got to go to the sixth form room. Could you take me there? I mean, for some reason, he had no idea where this was, sort of just showing how completely out of touch he was with what was going on in the school. And the other one was a verbal sort of communication, showing again that he had no way of communicating effectively with the boys. He called an emergency assembly. This story was just handed down from year to year. He called an emergency assembly. And as you may or may not know, but it'll become clear, the school was between two railway lines. He called, so boys assembled for the in the school theatre. And he said, I've just had the Great Eastern Railway on the telephone. They found two boys that had climbed over the fence onto the railway. They could have been killed, and that would have been a pity. and the whole, as you can imagine, the whole school collapsed in laughter at this, so he completely misjudged that one. Anyway, I've used the sort of the subheading, the worst school in England, which is what the Daily Mail called it in the early 1990s. And another popular and locally popular moniker for it was the Jewish Eton, because there was a period when there were a lot of Jewish boys at the school, and that contributed to the very high achieving academically at that point. So there's the two things going on. Sorry, I'm having problems with the clicker. Sorry? Sorry? Okay, thank you. That'd be great if we can move on. So, as I said, I very much don't want it to become a talk about nostalgia. So I wanted to do, as I said earlier, I think the school is very interesting for going through these different phases, almost epitomising the different phases of secondary education in the UK. I want to talk, one of the extraordinary things about the school was the academic achievements, particularly in the period between the end of the Second World War and the early 60s, I would say. And then the other reason why it became notorious rather than famous was because it was the first school in the country closed down by the state for political reasons, basically, in 1995. I thought I'd just start with a map. This is Hackney in 1750, just only a century before the school started, just showing how rural things were at that point. I won't stay with this because I'm sure there's other people covering this area, but just showing there's Hackney village in the middle, the other villages around Shacklewell, Hackney Wick, totally rural area 100 years before. And that's Mayor Street at the same time. Mayor Street just after the school set up. As I said, the school was set up and founded by the Grocers' Company, the sort of second tier, the second most important of the livery companies. That period, 1870, was particularly important educationally. The Second Reform Act had just passed, giving the vote to a much wider proportion of men, emphasise that, in the country. And this was when it was famously said that we must, by one of the aristocracy, we must educate our masters, sarcastically, that the working class now had access to education, had access to the vote, so they ought to be educated, probably to try and avoid revolution or whatever. But so this was a period when the school boards were set up, the school board for London, but also there was a lot of the livery companies had already set up schools much earlier. The Grocers' Company seems to have had a bad reputation generally, but at this point felt a pressure to start a school. Interestingly, they went to a guy called William Rogers, the Canon William Rogers, who, though he was a canon in the Church of England, seemed to have not believed a great deal. He was generally known as Hang Theology Rogers. He was, I suppose, typical of a certain sort of person. I mean, he was very much upper class. He was at Eton educated and went to Oxford. He rowed in one of the first boat races, but had radical ideas. So it was a period when, if you didn't go into politics, you might go into the church. So he went into the church, but seems to have had very little beliefs apart from bettering the working classes. So he was very important in education in London particularly. He helped set up City of London's, not City of London, Central Foundation School. And when the grocers were thinking of setting up the school, they came to him for advice. And it was his guidance, it was his leadership that pushed them into this idea of providing education for the lower middle classes, rather than, as I was saying, sort of just simply being an elevator to the universities. So the curriculum from the outset was not to teach Latin, because Latin was seen as the great thing you should aim for, and you needed Latin to get into Oxbridge. But the school from at the outset was intended to be for lower middle classes to work as clerks or in the city, in this sort of job, and not to, as Rogers himself said, there's enough curates and lawyers, we don't need any more of them, let's provide for the mercantile classes. So that was the aim. So this was part of the spec for the school. That it was to be a middle-class school for 500 boys without borders ever. It was to have a hall, a theatre or large room capable of accommodating 800 people, which it certainly never did. I don't know where that got lost somewhere in the building. 12 to 16 classrooms, accommodation for the headmaster and so on. And they found the school, because it was set up by a livery company, it had to be within 3 or 4 miles of the City of London. And they found a site. I should say at this point, if you know your Hackney, the school was on the same site as Mossbourne Academy. The site was between the two, just at Hackney Downs, where the railway divides. So there's the railway going at the top. That's an aerial photo taken in the 30s, I think. But the line at the top is the Cambridge line. The line at the bottom is the Edmonton line. And that's the school building in the middle. And Hackney Downs with lots of tennis courts there. They set up an architectural competition for the school, and I think that spec was really what they were looking for. They had about 120 or something entries. The spec also had a guide price for the building, and I think, I'm trying to remember, out of that 120, I think only 3 were within the guide price, which makes me think that the grocers company were being unrealistic in what they were expecting. Anyway, this was the winning design, which is more or less as it was built. This was an illustration, the sort of thing that architects like drawing up to recommend their work. What the couple were arm in arm in front of for, I don't know, but anyway. So, and that's the school as built, looking from the back and from Hackney Downs Station, with a Lower Edmonton train coming up towards Liverpool Street. The main building was the part in the middle. The other parts were added later. I'll come to them perhaps later. There's a gym on the right, and on the left were science labs. The first head, again, very much linked to William Rogers, who recommended this guy as the first headmaster. He had actually worked under him he had worked at Central Foundation School before, so he was very much a Rogers sort of guy. He was obviously a very bright guy who had done classics at Cambridge. Although his enthusiasm was for English, but there was no English taught at Oxford or Cambridge at that point. So, although he was an English enthusiast, he wouldn't have been able to read it at university. The other interesting thing about him was that he was very interested in Froebel, or I never know if it is Froebel or Froebel, but anyway, Froebel's theory, and this seems to be very, for the period, extraordinarily forward-looking. This was his aim in education, or how he understood education. It attacked the sort of current theory as the mere piling together of facts, of piling together of loose stones without mortar, without design. And the second part is very much from his Froebel ideas. If pupils are exposed to their native literature, rules of grammar will come to them sure enough but unconsciously. There's no necessity for those rules to be known in a codified form. He was very pioneering in his approach to education of that period. Most it was being sort of beaten in to boys with as rules and codifications. So he was appointed in 1875. Each year there was an inspection, a full-scale inspection. This was the report of the inspector in 1879. Special feature of the school is the teaching of English literature. So on the one hand, difficult to overestimate the value of this as a means of education. On the other hand, it seems to be the duty that lies nearest to us to train our literature to know and to be fond of the best literature of their own country. This object, extraordinary praise he gives, this object appears to me to be carried out with great success, with greater success indeed than any school I know of in Great Britain, which seems very high praise, but despite that, the Grocers' Company decided after 5 years that he wasn't the man for the job. I think for reasons that I said, that although they had explicitly appointed him because of his particular emphasis on English and to prepare boys for these sort of lower middle class jobs, there was pressure both from the company, the Grocers' Company, and from some parents that they actually wanted an education that included Latin and possibly Greek, and that there was a pressure to prepare them, partly because the London School Board was providing education free for boys, and the parents who were paying thought, well, ours should look better than the free education that other people are getting. So they appointed this guy, who was completely different. It's very difficult to understand why they appointed him apart from these sort of reasons. He was another classicist, but I mean the classicists were to a penny at that point. He had been a junior master at Dulwich College, which, as you know, was and is a leading public school. But the main claim to I'd say fame, but his claim to excellence was that he set up the Cadet Corps. And these were the sort of references that he presented, that they focused on his attention to physical education, acquaintance with financial matters, support is given to the gym and the playground, everything that's manly in sports and amusements of the boys. And they particularly emphasised his organisation and training of the Dulwich College Cadet Rifle Corps and his power as a disciplinarian. So a complete contrast, you couldn't think more so. In fact, when he was appointed, he quite soon afterwards caned the entire sixth form for some misdemeanour or sort of general. So he was the head for the next 30 years, pushing the school much more to a sort of public school, disciplined, here they all are, the staff. I love these slightly camp look they all have. And I think the guy at the top with the top hat is the sort of school porter. But at the beginning of this period, the staff were not particularly well. I think of the staff, only 2 had degrees. The others had some sort of training, but only 2 had degrees. Over that period, over his period as head, there were more and more with an academic training. But his in the spec, you remember that it talked about a theatre. One of the architecturally unusual things about the school was the school theatre, and it came into its own, was obviously later with the drama at the school. It was a sort of amphitheatre without chairs, so that people sat on the steps, and there was a little platform at the front. This was and in the early years, the theatre was used by Hackney for public events. There was a debating society. It's interesting you mentioned about gentrification, because at this period there were parts of Hackney that were quite gentrified. So this was I'm not sure exactly what, but some form of public meeting. It's interesting the way the men, and at first glance it looks as if it's women's meeting, but in fact it's just the women are at the front and the men are very much segregated at the back. And again, there's the school porter with his hat towards the back. And this is the school, actually from a postcard at the turn of the century. So this, under this period, it was very much a sort of I was going to say Tom Brown school days, but very much a formal school, and a huge emphasis on discipline and physical punishment. We saw a picture of the gym in the overall picture before. The gym and swimming pool weren't added until the 1890s, 25 years after the school was founded. And interestingly, it was a gym and pool. In the winter, the pool was, a floor was put across the swimming pool and it became the gym. And then for the summer term, it was a swimming pool. And controversially, I think it was only after the Second World War, for 20 years, everybody swam naked. It was the reason given was that the fibres from swimming costumes might clog up the filters, but whether this was the real reason, I have no idea. But anyway, I suffered from that like everybody else. This was an early picture of a chemistry lab. Again, I mean, Gull, the headmaster at this period, was very traditional in his approach. I mean, he had to be sort of forced, dragging, sort of screaming and shouting to even start teaching science. It wasn't something that was taught at the school for the first 20, 25 years. But eventually labs were introduced. I mean, interestingly, they very much, I mean, they look very much like that even when I was there in the 50s. They've very little changed. And they also added a workshop for metalwork and woodwork at this period. So, in 1905, well, for this whole period, 1875 to 1905, the Grocers' Company found they were having to subsidise the school. It was running at a loss each year. And I think this was completely unanticipated. I think they had thought, we will set up the school, we'll build the school, and it'll be self-running, jolly nice, and we'll put our name on it and our coat of arms and kudos for the Grocers' Company. Whereas in fact they had to subsidise the school for £2,000 or £3,000 a year for that entire period. I think the combination of, so when the LCC, the London County Council, took over education for London as a whole, the grocers simply gave the school to the London County Council. So they got shot of it. And after that, any connection with them was really nominal. For sort of traditional reasons, the school then had the long name of Hackney Downs Grammar School, formerly the Grocers' Company. So that was the sort of official name. And that's, I mean, in Hackney at that time, and you know, throughout the 20th century really, people often called the school grocers. So the next head, Jenkins Thomas, again had a long period from, he was head for 30 years again, from 1905 to the mid-30s. He again carried on this very traditional grammar school approach. The school did very well, but the thing that he did, it's very difficult to see why. He was incredibly parsimonious. Every 5 years there was an inspection. The inspectors again and again pointed out that he didn't buy new textbooks. The classes were too big. He just was penny pinching all the way through. Although the school was run by the LCC and there could have been funds. Interestingly, one of the chair of governors for a long period here was Nettie Adler, who was a leading Jewish philanthropist and daughter of the chief rabbi. So from this early period, there was important Jewish involvement with the school. As I said earlier, the cadet corps was an important part of Charles Gull's contribution to the school, and it went on again until the 1930s, when the LCC were very much against this and abolished it again against the wishes of some of the parents and some of the pupils. I thought I'd just drop this in. This was Mayor Street, as an illustration of Mayor Street in the 30s, and actually the book, it's not a particularly great book, but it was a novel written by a pupil from that period. So by this time, something like 40 or 50% of the boys at the school were Jewish. And this was an interesting, looking back, Cyril Spector as a writer, broke down the divisions in the school. He says there's a subtle class and social division that soon became apparent. First, a division between Jews and non-Jews. Second, a division between fee-paying and scholarship boys. Thirdly, the gap between those who came from the south side, Clapton, and from the more prosperous north, Stamford Hill. Then he ends it, since I was only a Jewish scholarship boy from Clapton, I was at the bottom of the pile. This is the school theatre in 35, with a picture of the notorious Charles Gull hanging, and they were doing exams at the time. I'd forgotten, I mean, I must have done exams there. I'd forgotten until I saw the photo that that's where we did our exams. And this is a period when some of the names of former pupils are quite well known. Abraham Games was a pupil at the school in the 30s. He is hugely well known as the graphic designer who created the image for the festival hall. As here. The next head, Toby Bourke, T.O. Bourke, everybody for obvious reason knew him as Toby, was very much a reformer, very necessary. He was the head for the important period of the Second World War, much more liberal than those before him, and very much suited to being a head of a school As far as I can tell, he was very much an agnostic, but was very successful in running a school for Jewish and Gentile pupils. The school was evacuated to King's Lynn during the Second World War, and even King only put that in to show that King's Lynn itself was not immune from German attention. And the school shared premises with the King Edward VII School in King's Lynn during the war. Though even there, the school was bombed and damaged, though not destroyed. During the war, the school buildings of Hackney Downs were used for various things, and one of them was just for dumping material salvaged from bombed buildings nearby. So it became, but it was also, I think, used for other emergency purposes, and the swimming pool was used as a, as a reserve for water needed by the fire services. So there's a long period when there's no education in the school, and then gradually they returned. There's a nice description of that period. That's when the school returned. I included that because it's probably one of the most successful achieving years. The people like Harold Pinter in the back row there, third from the right, Maurice Peston, Robert Peston's dad, who became Lord Peston, a guy who, Barry Supple, who became the Master of Queen's College, Cambridge. A period of, despite the fact they'd been pupils during the evacuation period and with the disruption of the war, they achieved huge things. And this was a period when Mosleyite demonstrations were going on. This is Pinter in Macbeth, which everybody involved in it remembers as an extraordinary bit of acting, and the whole production. There he says, and then next year, you probably know he was best. He came to fame first as an actor before his writing. That's a later portrait of him, and his boyhood home has now got a blue plaque. But he wasn't the only writer from that period. Roland Camberton, whose actual name was Henry Cohen, it's thought he got his pen name from a mixture of Camberwell and Brixton, Camberton, another writer from this, and Alexander Barron, who inexplicably had become lost, but I think his reputation is being recovered now. He wrote an extraordinary trilogy about the Second World War. He served in the Second World War, and then wrote a huge number of plays for television. That's the best known of his wartime novels. As you say, it's known as the finest British novel about the Second World War. And another writer from the period, not so well known, not such a great book. This is actually the guy who I talked about at the beginning, who, as I say, very few people have got anything much to say about him. This is a nice sort of summary of what was going on class-wise about the school. It's curious, the school was a middle-class, a school with a middle-class ethos, but made up almost entirely of working-class boys. I'll just put that in for fun. The time when boxing was still taught at schools. And going back to the theatre, this was during the 50s. There was an extraordinary series of plays put on. This was a design for the set, and they were done in that amphitheatre, designed specifically for it. And that was Oedipus Rex. Again, the art department, the woodwork people and the drama people all combined on that. And there were the ordinary activities, the railway club. Alec Williams was the next head, and he went through a very difficult period of the school. That's a view of the school. Oh, sorry, of Hackney Downs station from the school. And that's a boy did this woodcut from Andre Street. That was sort of back way into the school. So the big crisis at this period was the school fire, when the school was put out of use completely for a term, and we were, sorry, the we comes in here, it says period when I was at the school. Disastrous fire, and for a period we were sort of scattered into various premises around Hackney. That's the school after the fire. That's the theatre. The fire almost certainly started in the school theatre. They were about to put a play on, and somebody left a rheostat on overnight. That's just sort of teaching in this period. Yeah. So this was a period of enormous change. The comprehensivisation was going on, and the school was gradually being. So the school was rebuilt, but then the plans for rebuilding had to go wider. So I need to move through a bit quicker. That was the building. They were the new buildings, which with hindsight, I think were very poorly, shoddily put together. That was the assembly in the new building. That was just to put in, this was a period of maximums of academic excellence at the school, showing the number of going into further education. The final head was John Kemp, who was taught at the school and then became head. And it was who was there during the comprehensive period. That's just defining how deprived Hackney was at that period. This was the new school buildings. And he himself says then, as I said at the beginning, the school as a comprehensive was very, very successful at first under his leadership, but it almost became a victim of its own success, and they were sort of boasting about it here and there. And it went very quickly from there to this period when there were all sorts of problems. That's a sort of chronology of the last years when the school was just subject to inspection, to inspection after inspection, report after report. It had no time to recover. It had financial problems. It had premises problems. And finally, I won't go into detail, I mean, the school was closed by the Tory government as an example to others. This was the beginning of the whole Ofsted experiment and league tables, and the school was picked on as having terrible results, which it didn't necessarily. I mean, it didn't have great results. There were reasons, and I think, yeah. So the school was closed down. That's just a picture of what it looked like when it was abandoned. That's the swimming pool. It was such a notorious thing that some of the former teachers and academics wrote this about the fight to keep the school open. I think this is a very good summing up of why it closed. It was a failed school rather than a failing school, which I think sums it up. And as I said at the beginning, it has no organic or institutional links with Mossbourne. In fact, I think when it closed, Hackney Council had hoped they could sell the land and use it, but by the covenants they couldn't. But 5 years afterwards, Mossbourne Academy was thought up and has succeeded hugely, as you know, on the same grounds. That's Mossbourne today. That's back to the Grocers Company.
A few minutes closest company actually were persuaded by the original Hackney Downs pupils to have an interest as gardeners within Mossbourne.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Any questions? If we can keep them brief, Neil?
It's not a question, it's a comment really, because one of the things which it'll be brief. So I was there from 1965 to 1972. And one of the things I think, just to add to the story really, was the impact of what was happening outside the school. So in that period of time, there was what's called counterculture. So when we were in the school, we produced this magazine called The Irresponsible Generation Bites Back. And we went on strike for a day, inspired by the Little Red School Book. And that was partly because of the influence of the teachers who I kind of call the post-68 generation. And we did things like we went to watch Jazz Video, which I'm sure will get us sacked.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I had to rush through the second part a bit. And absolutely. But even earlier, there's boys even in the 40s who said, I always had the impression that the masters had a pink disposition, you know, they leaned leftwards.
Yes, sorry. I'm Geoffrey Alderman. I'm
Hi,
the
Geoffrey.
historian of the school. I want to make 2 points very briefly. Firstly, Court Oak Bowen was sacked by the Grocers' Company because he was insisting that boys learn English from his own textbooks.
I don't think there's evidence for that, Geoffrey.
I do. Will read my history of the
I know
school.
I have.
Yeah. Secondly, the Vernon Barkway Pye, very short story. He was conducting an assembly and Mr. Boyd at the organ was striking up Hills of the North Rejoice. One of the false organ pipes fell forward and hit a first former on the head, and the first former was writhing in agony. 2 or 3 masters rushed from the platform to help the boy, and Mr. Barkway Pye shouted out, "Leave him alone till we finish the hymn."
It does add to my anecdotes about him.
Any other question over here?
Yeah, I saw on the slides you spoke in 1991. There was a dispute of some sort about black staff. Can you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's difficult to sum it up quickly. What I didn't cover was that in the last 15 years, there were groups from a lot of different racial groups in the school. And at one point, the black parents and black staff were combining groups within the school. There's a lot of conflict and very difficult to contain.
Is any of this, what you look when you see Mossbourne Academy, does any of it contain buildings that were from the Hackney Downs period, or is it all modern?
No, they completely flattened the site. So there was a point at which the stones, and I'm not sure if they're still. Yeah, are they still at the? Yeah, just the stones that were above the front door were kept.